Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Mudd, Global Digital and Connected Product Certification Director at BSI, responsible for IoT, and I've been working with the IoTSF for a few years now. In this session, we're going to explore the supply chain and its impact on IoT security. All IoT manufacturers are dependent to some extent on their supply chain, from a complete OEM solution down to perhaps just an individual chip, piece of firmware. We're going to look at what that dependency means in terms of your overall IoT security as a manufacturer. So after a brief look at BSI and IoT to give some context, I'm then going to look at the scope of the supply chain problem and bring that to life with some real-world examples that we've seen in our own test labs. Then going to look at the impact of that on you and your business and the emerging guidance, and also look at BSI's approach to help mitigate that risk and these problems. Then going to finish off with 3 actions for everyone to take away from today. So firstly, BSI and IoT. BSI, for over 120 years, we've been shaping and supporting best practice across industries through our work in standards, now assurance, and also consultancy. And governed by Royal Charter, it means that we're here to work for the public good and independent of government and independent of shareholders. And we're very much a global organisation. The majority of our clients, and indeed our own people, are outside of the UK. And certainly in the IoT world, we have now in our labs products from as far apart as Japan, China, Korea, India, the Middle East, across Europe, the UK, and into the US. So I'm really coming to you from a global perspective on this. In our IoT Centre of Excellence, we combine our long history of product certification with expert cyber skills. BSI has acquired 3 cybersecurity organisations over the last few years and integrated those thoroughly within our product certification activity. So, approved by CREST and doing work for the National Cybersecurity Centre, we have those top-level skills but embedded within pragmatic product risk assessment. So, what's the scope of this problem? What are we talking about here as the supply chain when it comes to IoT? Now, initially, we'll think of hardware as the most obvious part, the devices and controllers, and in particular now, any kind of hardware associated with IoT inevitably has firmware, and certainly this is where we see some of the key issues and risks. But also in the software, quite often around the manufacturer's device, there may be applications, software applications that are developed by third parties, part of the supply chain. And then critically, services. Services could be a whole range of things, from integration, those who are providing an integration service, pulling together various aspects to help support you deliver your overall product or service. But also it may be specifically things around ICT management, cloud provisioning, or security provisioning. All of these are key elements of your supply chain that impact your IoT security. I'm now going to bring that to life with stories from what we've seen in the lab. And here's the guys in the lab been working through the whole of the current crisis. And it'd be really interesting, as we'll see, some of the issues that we found and how they can trace back through the supply chain. But very critically, we only test products at the request of the manufacturer. Furthermore, our clients generally have a very professional, solid approach to product quality, safety and security. They'll have business processes, quality management systems, and they will be evaluating suppliers. We also give guidance to the areas covered by our testing, referring back to the standards that we're using. So none of this comes as a complete surprise or shock to the manufacturers of products under test with us. And generally speaking, they are submitting products believing that they will pass. So all the things I'm going to talk about now are examples of issues we've found despite all of this, despite the fact that the manufacturers are professional in their approach, they've had guidance, they understand what the products will be going through, we're still finding problems like this. So we'll start with hardware. And yes, we found things like test points and debugging connections that haven't been removed. unused open ports, very, very obvious things that actually then increase the overall attack surface. But it's when we come to the firmware on these devices that things really have come to life when we're looking at supply chain impact. A whole load of things relating to lack of encryption, keys and credential storage, sensitive data, even down to things like comments that haven't been removed. And they have been as blunt of, oh, we've still got a bug here on this line that needs fixing. And then also test code that's been left on there. Now, all of the above we've seen occasionally in products that have been designed totally in-house, but we've also seen all of this on products that have come in through the supply chain, but we've also seen problems like this. Totally relevant applications that presumably the supplier has put a whole load of different applications on one particular product that can be used in lots of different markets and just hasn't removed them, increasing the overall attack vector and attack surface. But very, very concerned have been the times we found third-party sensitive data, not even related to our particular client whatsoever, where a supplier has made a product that they're supplying to a whole load of manufacturers and put a whole load of data on there and sent that out to everybody unencrypted. We'll come on to the software then. So sometimes then when an app has been developed or a piece of software has been developed to support an overall IoT product, that's been outsourced. And we've seen cases there with weak passwords, either strength or recovery policy, and in particular weak input validation, which remains one of the biggest vulnerabilities we see in general with apps and software. But in particular where we have a supplied app from a third party, what we tend to find is issues with integration. And I guess some of this may be not so much a dependency on that third party, but it's around that supplier management and how the manufacturer pulls these elements together. So we might have seen several times a lack of integrity and authenticity checks between the app and the actual devices. But also, more subtly, we've seen a lack of a systematic approach to how communications fault reporting goes that may result in a false sense of security looking at the software app and status of the products, not necessarily indicating some of the issues that are actually residing there in real time with the devices, because that whole of that integration from that third-party software has not taken all of this into account and ending up with this false sense of security. When it comes on to services, here again, some very, very different issues I would like to highlight. One of the really interesting ones we saw was an integrator working for the manufacturer, pulling together various building blocks relating to the connectivity and the IoT aspect of the product. And they were using some industrial control software that had really good functionality, but wasn't really suited to the task of connected applications. And what we found, it was very easy to get the whole system to crash and fall over and reset to a factory default, allowing easy access right into the system. And this could be for every single device. Now, in this particular case, the manufacturer had come to us in good time. They were one of the ones that did think, oh, we might have some issues here, because their area of expertise was around the core functionality of the product rather than the IoT connectivity. And this is a common problem. So we were able to identify early. It delayed the launch, but at least that very, very critical fault was detected before it went live to market. We tend to find a lot of issues around cloud service. This isn't so much poor cloud service provision by the third party. This is more to do with how manufacturers of IoT products interface with that cloud environment. In particular, understanding what responsibilities are on them that impact security and availability. And how does this manifest itself? We have seen on several occasions cases where we have insecure server configuration and also bugs that have been introduced through the manufacturer's route that have caused server outages and availability problems. So again, this isn't necessarily a poor cloud service provider. This is around that supplier management and managing, understanding one's own responsibilities as much as evaluating the third-party supplier. And then we'll come on to support. So here's one example we've seen several times. So we have a product undergoing test, we identify a vulnerability, we report that back, our client goes back through their supply chain, here's a problem, you guys fix this, blah, 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 off we go. They come back to us, this product is now fixed. The software has been up-revved and yep, we fixed the fault. We go and test it and the fault's still there. Now, luckily, that revision that went in to actually fix that fault went through our process first, we detected it. Imagine had this been in the live environment and this had been a externally reported vulnerability and out goes the public fix for it and it hasn't done it. Then we've also had issues where the product that's sent to us, the client says, oh, this is still compliant with the previous spec, the firmware hasn't changed. And we can see quite clearly it has changed. And we've had two different scenarios that we've seen here. Sometimes, yes, the firmware has been up-versioned, but it's not being communicated effectively to the client. That in itself is a problem in terms of that supplier management and understanding the change control that's going on in the background around you, the manufacturer, and your product. But some it's been more concerning where the version hasn't changed, yet clearly the firmware has. So that calls to in question really deeper issues around the trust in that supply chain. These are all very real issues. Everything I've talked about today has happened in that context of a responsible manufacturer with a proven track record in process and quality management, believing they're doing the right thing and submitting products they believe are compliant. And we've still found issues like this, and we find them on a regular basis. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the scope of the problem that we're dealing with here. So what's the impact? I'm sure you guys are all aware of the three big issues that can effectively happen when your device is compromised. Lose control of the device, loss of data, or be party to part of a distributed denial of service attack or subject to it, all caused by insecure IoT devices. But there's another issue as well that's particularly relevant to me, and this is around vulnerabilities and disclosure. Security researchers are a massively important part of the fight against cybercrime. They are an extremely valuable tool for IoT device manufacturers in helping identify vulnerabilities quickly and effectively. But you have to respond correctly and effectively. If you don't, it can cause problems. I'm going to use an example now from Pen Test Partners, and I know Ken Monroe is also speaking at this event, and thanks to Ken for this great example of what can happen if you do not have a robust process for responsible disclosure of vulnerabilities. So in this particular case from March 2019, bottom left, automotive security on Pen Test Partners' website, they'd identified some vulnerabilities around smart car alarms, and after not having necessarily the right responses from the manufacturers, got to the point in needing to disclose this. Okay, so great, it goes on a security researcher's website. Same day, that hits the national media. That can be just as damaging to your product and your business as any criminal attack. And how can you possibly have a robust vulnerability disclosure policy if you're not in control of the supply chain? Just think about those problems that I just highlighted to you that we had seen. How can you have a responsible vulnerability disclosure and prevent this kind of issue if you are not in control? And when we're looking at some of the vulnerabilities that have been in the media this year, yes, we still get the odd one talking about individual devices, but you have things like Ripple 20. And we've had the first devices coming through with Ripple 20 on them. And in one particular case, our client insisted there was no way, but they went back through their supply chain and yes, we were correct, it was there. We've seen issues around mobile apps with increasing flagging of vulnerabilities, even around critical applications such as banking. And then on the services side of things, we've seen universities lose their data because their cloud service provider has been subject to a ransomware attack. So all of these things are very real and they're happening today. And then we come on to compliance. Looking at the proposed regulation in the UK for consumer IoT, that's based on the first three principles within the Code of Practice for Consumer IoT Security that's now effectively been embodied in the European standard, the ETSI EN 303645. The first three principles seem straightforward: no default passwords, a vulnerability disclosure policy, and a software update and lifetime update policy as well. Should be straightforward, but I've just talked about issues where all three of these have been compromised by the supply chain. A factory reset to a default password. Vulnerability disclosure. How can you manage that when you're not in control and key elements of that firmware are back in the supply chain? Likewise, software updates. How can you declare a lifetime policy unless you're in control of that supply chain? So the impact here is, at best, a delayed launch, like I mentioned with the integrator. If not, you're launching with unknown vulnerabilities. That means financial, legal, and reputational damage. Think about security researchers. This is not just criminal hacks. And then we also have compliance with the imminent UK regulation. So you can see now how critical this supply chain management is. So what can you actually do about it? Well, the good news is there is emerging top-level guidance, literally last month from ENISA. So guidelines for securing the IoT supply chain. It's a top-level set of principles and an excellent starting point. It's not a full standard, but it's a great place to start. Building on that, there's also the NIST document from earlier this year in June, giving foundational guidance on cybersecurity for IoT device manufacturers. Again, this is guidance, not a standard, but it's an excellent document that sets out some very straightforward strategies and principles for security across the whole of the life cycle. And though it's not explicitly around supply chain, those principles can be applied. So straight away, there are two easy to read and understand top-level documents that are international best practice freely available today. Now, when we talk about the key principles here, what they focus on really is engagement with the supply chain. This isn't a situation where you can really go and use Alibaba and search around on price and chop and change between suppliers. To have a robust security position, you need to engage and you need to collaborate with that supply chain all the way through to ensure all the stakeholders understand the importance of embedding security by design and the problems that will happen if they're not. And then making sure that approach is clear and consistent throughout that supply chain. Now that's great, and it goes into a lot of detail around that, how you can actually apply that. But what I'm sure a lot of you are thinking is, well, here I am right now, I've got potential suppliers out there I'm dealing with right now. How do I manage this? So here's looking specifically at how to engage with choosing an appropriate supplier. You need to look at, do they have a secure development lifecycle? How do they then actually prove that? Code reviews, testing, are they involving third-party components, hardware and firmware? Do they have resilience as a key factor within their design, looking how to mitigate potential vulnerabilities to prevent them being exploited wider through the system? Do they have a security update program? I would certainly hope so. What is it? And also, critically, how long will that product and platform be supported? And then, vulnerability management. What's their position around responsible disclosure? Because without that, yours will not be really valid either. And when you're looking at all of that, in order to really have this to support you throughout that product life cycle, you need to have a service level agreement in place. This isn't a one-shot, I bought this, I stick it in the product and get it out there. In order to be robust, you need to have all this and you need to have it wrapped up in an SLA. Now, I know you can think, oh, all of this comes at a cost, I can't afford this. But it's absolutely critical that you get to that point of having confidence in them as a supplier. So you get to the point of an SLA, two more points to add to that. How do they evaluate their own suppliers? And then do you end up with a BOM, and in particular a security BOM that you can, a software BOM that you can actually trust? So once you look at all that, there's a lot that maybe it means you can't just go for the cheapest option, but also in doing all this, particularly down to how they evaluate their own suppliers and all of that, not every supplier will be able to achieve. And you start to think, does this limit me? Does this mean I'm going to spend a load more time and money on a more expensive product? Maybe yes, to some extent. And there is a continuum here. At one end, you've got, yeah, it's the lower cost, but lower confidence in that security. And it goes all the way to the other end of having high confidence. It's your decision where you sit on that continuum. But that decision impacts you, your business, those you do business with, and your customers. So what is your risk appetite, and what risk appetite are you projecting on those that you work with and those that you supply? When we're assessing a product, yes, we do a type test in the lab, and many of the issues that I've talked about, we found all of those in the lab. But that's only a part of the story. To address these effectively, it's not a case of fixing the problem and sending it into the lab to be tested. We won't place a mark of trust on a product unless we've assessed the organization that sits behind it. And we continue to assess both the product and the organization throughout the life of that certification. And there we are really focusing on control of the supply chain, engineering change, patch management and support, vulnerability disclosure, linking the whole of that supply chain together. That's the only way that we get to the point we can place a mark of trust on an IoT product. That trust says the product will work as it should, safely and securely. By that I mean having the appropriate controls in place for its intended use throughout its intended life. A problem we've been solving for well over 100 years, and we're updating now to reflect the digital world where it's never been more important. Now I want to finish up with 3 actions to take away. Firstly, how should you approach the supply chain management issue? Well, download that document. International best practice just released, it's there. Secondly, work out who's actually supplying you and consider all the aspects. So obviously the hardware, the firmware, how far down that chain do you need to go to get an understanding from your suppliers, what their suppliers are, and then look at not just the software, but also the services. Who's supplying you for all of these areas? What evaluation has been done on the organization as well as the product or service? Have they got security by design and resilience designed in, built in from the outset? Vulnerability management, responsible disclosure, how's that going to impact you? And above all then, have you got a service level agreement in place to give you some kind of confidence to back up your own warrants and assurances you're having to give to your clients? And then finally, what are they actually supplying? The technical spec, does it address security? Is there a hardware and software BOM that considers alternative components and you understand how engineering change is going to impact all that? And how do they manage their own suppliers and their own bill of materials and software bill of materials? Then all of this comes down to trust, and that's about the relationship you have with that supplier, going back to engagement and collaboration. But that starts with understanding who they are and what they're supplying you. So a quick summary. IoT security in the supply chain involves hardware, firmware, software, but critically, it also involves services. There is a very significant risk, financial, legal, and reputational. Think security researchers as well as criminal hacks. There is new guidance from ENISA specifically aimed at securing the IoT supply chain with a big focus on supplier relationships and collaboration. It's impossible to assess all of this purely through testing in the lab. Initial and ongoing supplier evaluation is critical. What's your risk appetite? Because there is a continuum here looking at cost and risk. 3 actions to take away today. Download that ENISA guide, identify your suppliers, and identify what they're supplying you, the BOM and the SBOM. Thank you for your time. We've now got time for a Q&A, and then please also look out for the next session where we'll be exploring what the IoTSF is doing to support you further in this area. Thank you.